silver tray trembled in Arya's hands as she navigated the marble corridors of the palace, her head bowed so low that her chin nearly touched her chest. 5 years of working in the royal household had taught her that invisibility was survival, that making herself small meant making herself safe. The other servants whispered that she moved like a ghost through these halls, silent and substanceless. And they were right. Ghosts didn't get noticed. And not being noticed meant not getting hurt. The scars hidden beneath her long sleeves told stories she refused to speak aloud, permanent reminders of a time when love had meant fists, and cruelty had worn the face of a mate bond. Her wolf had been silent for 3 years now, retreating so deep inside her that sometimes Arya wondered if she had simply ceased to exist, extinguished by the man who had rejected her after using her broken body as an outlet for his rage. King Caden Thornwood stood in his private study surrounded by maps and military reports, his massive frame radiating the kind of power that made hardened warriors step back instinctively. At 6 feet 5 inches of pure muscle and dominance, he was everything an alpha king should be, with eyes like storm clouds and a presence that commanded absolute obedience. His reputation preceded him in every territory of the realm, spoken of in whispers as the warrior king who had united the packs through strength and strategic brilliance, who showed no mercy to enemies and no softness to anyone. He had never wanted a mate, had built his entire identity around being untouchable and unbreakable, a force of nature rather than a man with vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Love was a weakness he couldn't afford, not when he carried the weight of an entire kingdom on his shoulders, and enemies circled like vultures waiting for any sign of fracture in his armor. The moment that changed everything happened on a Tuesday afternoon, when frustration over a border dispute with the Northern Territories had Caden's temper running hot. Arya had entered his study to deliver his afternoon tea, moving with that peculiar silent grace that came from years of trying not to exist too loudly. She had been reaching to set the tray on his desk when Caden, absorbed in a particularly infuriating report, threw his hand up in an angry gesture of dismissal without looking up. It was nothing, just a wave of his hand to indicate he didn't want to be disturbed, a movement he had made 1,000 times before with 1,000 different servants. But Arya saw that hand rising toward her, and something primitive and terrified took over, some deep instinct carved into her bones by repeated trauma. She dropped the tray with a crash that seemed to echo through eternity, stumbling backward with her arms raised to protect her head, her entire body curling inward in a defensive posture that spoke of intimate familiarity with violence. Her eyes, when they finally met his, were wide with absolute terror. The kind of fear that only comes from having been hurt so badly and so often that the expectation of pain becomes reflexive. Caden froze, his hand still raised in the air, and for the first time in his adult life, he felt something crack open in his chest. The mate bond slammed into him with the force of a physical blow, gold threads of connection spinning out from his heart to hers, and the reality of what he was seeing hit him like a war hammer to the gut. His mate, the one person in the entire world meant for him, was terrified that he was going to hit her. She wasn't just scared, she was bracing for impact. Her body remembering a violence that had been repeated so many times, it had become muscle memory. The powerful Alpha King, who had stared down death on countless battlefields without flinching, felt his knees give out beneath him. He crashed to the floor in front of her, this massive, dominant alpha on his knees before a cowering omega. And the movement was so unexpected that Arya's defensive posture faltered in confusion. His voice, when it came, was shattered and raw, in a way that no one in the kingdom had ever heard. "I will never raise my hand to you," he said, and each word felt like it was being torn from somewhere deep in his chest. "I swear on my life, on my crown, on everything I am, I will never hurt you. Please, I need you to breathe." The mate bond was singing between them now, impossible to ignore, and Arya felt her wolf stir for the first time in 3 years, drawn to the surface by the presence of her true mate. But the fear was still there, carved so deeply into her psyche that even the sacred bond couldn't simply erase it. She was shaking, her whole body trembling like a leaf in a storm. And Caden remained on his knees, making himself smaller, making himself less threatening, every dominant instinct in his body screaming at him, even as he forced himself to stay down. "Tell me who did this to you," he said quietly, and there was something lethal threading through the gentleness in his tone. Tell me who taught you to fear a raised hand. Arya's breath came in short gasps as she struggled to process what was happening, her mind unable to reconcile the image of the most powerful alpha in the realm kneeling before her with everything she had learned about her own worthlessness. Marcus, she finally whispered, the name tasting like ash on her tongue. My former mate. He rejected me after 3 years. Said I was too weak, too broken, not worth the bond. The words were clinical, emotionless, because if she let herself feel while saying them, she would shatter completely. Caden's eyes flashed gold with his wolf's rage, but he kept his body carefully still, every movement slow and deliberate. How long ago? He asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. Didn't want to hear how long his mate had been suffering while he remained oblivious to her existence. 3 years since the rejection, she said softly. 5 years of the rest. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, there was something broken and determined in their depths. I cannot undo what was done to you, he said carefully. I cannot erase your scars or make your fear disappear with pretty words. But I can promise you this. From this moment forward, you will never have reason to fear me. I will prove it to you every single day for as long as it takes. You are my mate, and you deserve to be treated like the queen you are. If you're enjoying this story of healing and second chances, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to hear more tales of love that transforms and redeems. Your support means everything and helps us bring you more stories that matter. The palace erupted in chaos when word spread that the unmated Alpha King had found his mate among the Omega servants. The Royal Council, a group of traditionalist alphas who had served the crown for generations, demanded an immediate audience. Chief Tarts, Counselor Aldrich, a silver-haired alpha with cunning eyes and a smile that never reached them, led the charge. Your Majesty, he began with carefully measured deference. Surely you understand the concerns this raises. An Omega with no family lineage, no training in royal protocols, no political connections to strengthen the kingdom. The other council members murmured agreement, their disapproval hanging heavy in the air. Caden stood behind his desk, every inch the commanding king. But his eyes held a warning that made even Aldrich hesitate. Are you questioning the sacred mate bond, counselor? He asked with deadly calm. Are you suggesting that the moon goddess made an error in her divine wisdom? Aldrich backtracked smoothly, too experienced a politician to fall into such an obvious trap. Of course not, Your Majesty. We merely suggest that perhaps the kingdom would be better served if you took additional mates, as is your right as Alpha King. Strengthen political alliances while honoring the mate bond. The words were calculated, designed to sound reasonable, but Caden saw the trap clearly. They wanted Arya marginalized, pushed aside, made irrelevant before she could even step into her role as queen. Over my dead body, he said flatly. Arya is my only mate, and she will be recognized as the sole queen of this realm. Any laws or customs that suggest otherwise will be changed. Immediately, the council session dissolved into barely contained outrage, but Caden dismissed them with a wave of his hand, his decision final and absolute. What he didn't know was that Aldrich had his own reasons for wanting Arya kept from power, secrets that went back decades and involved the very foundations of how Omegas were treated throughout the kingdom. For too long, a system of oppression had benefited those in power, and a queen who had suffered under that system would be far too dangerous to the established order. Arya's quarters were moved from the servants' wing to rooms adjacent to the king's personal chambers, a suite of rooms so vast and luxurious that she felt lost in them. Caden visited her every day, but he never stayed long, and he never came closer than she seemed comfortable with. He would sit in a chair across the room and simply talk, telling her about his day, asking about hers, sharing stories from his childhood that revealed vulnerabilities she never expected from the fearsome Alpha King. He was trying, she realized, trying to show her that he could be trusted. That proximity to him didn't have to mean pain. It was working, slowly, the fear beginning to recede by tiny increments as days turned into weeks, and his promises proved consistent. One evening, she found the courage to ask him the question that had been haunting her. Why? She said quietly. looking at him across the expanse of her sitting room. "Why do you care so much about earning my trust? You're the king. You could simply command me to accept the bond, to act as your queen. No one would question it." Caden was quiet for a long moment, his storm-gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Because commanding you would make me no better than the man who hurt you," he said finally. "Because you deserve the choice that was stolen from you before. Because a mate bond should be a sanctuary, not another prison. I want you to choose me, Arya. Not because you have to, but because you want to. Even if that takes years. Even if it never happens. You deserve that. Freedom." The vulnerability in his words cracked something open in her chest, and for the first time since the bond had snapped into place, she took a step toward him instead of away. It was a small step, barely more than a shuffle, but his face transformed with hope so profound it was almost painful to witness. The most powerful alpha in the realm, brought to his knees by the possibility that his broken mate might be beginning to heal. But healing was never a straight line, and the trauma carved into Arya's bones didn't disappear just because she was beginning to trust. There were still moments when a sudden movement would send her spiraling into panic, still nights when nightmares left her screaming and shaking. Caden learned to move slowly around her, to announce his presence before entering a room, to keep his voice gentle even when discussing kingdom business that made his alpha instincts roar for dominance. He assigned her a personal guard, not to watch her, but to make her feel safe. A female beta warrior named Sarah, who had survived her own trauma and understood the long road to recovery. The turning point came 2 months after the bond had formed, when Marcus showed up at the palace gates demanding an audience with the king. He was everything Arya remembered and worse, a brutish alpha with cold eyes and a smile that promised cruelty. He claimed that since he had never formally completed the rejection in front of witnesses, Arya was still technically his mate, and the king had no right to her. The legal argument was thin, barely holding together under scrutiny, but it was enough to require a formal hearing before the council. Arya attended the hearing because Caden asked her to, because he promised she wouldn't have to face Marcus alone. She sat beside the king's throne, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white, while Marcus presented his case with a confidence that made her stomach turn. He spoke of property rights and ancient customs, never once looking at her like she was a person rather than a possession to be reclaimed. When it was Caden's turn to respond, he stood with the lethal grace of a predator, and his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "You speak of ancient customs," he said, his eyes locked on Marcus with an intensity that made the other alpha squirm. "Then let us honor the oldest custom of all, trial by combat. You claim she is yours, I claim she is mine. We settle this the way our ancestors did, wolf to wolf, and the victor's claim stands uncontested." The council chamber erupted in shocked murmurs because formal combat challenges between alphas were rare and brutal, often ending in death. Marcus paled, clearly not having expected the king to stake his own life on the outcome, but pride and stupidity made him accept. 3 days, he said, trying to sound confident. 3 days to prepare. Caden turned to Arya then, his expression softening as he took in her terrified face. "I will not let him take you," he said quietly, speaking only to her even though the entire council watched. "I will end this threat permanently, but I need you to know that I'm not fighting him because I own you or because you're property to be won. I'm fighting because you deserve to be free of him, to never have to fear him again. If you want me to find another way, any other way, I will. The choice is yours." Arya looked at this man who had spent 2 months proving his worth through patience and gentleness, who had changed laws and challenged his own counsel for her, who knelt before her even when his instincts demanded dominance. "I want him gone," she whispered. "I want to be free. Then free you shall be," Caden promised. And there was death in his eyes when he looked back at Marcus. The 3 days before the combat were the longest of Arya's life. Caden spent hours in the training grounds, his beta commanders working him through combat drills, even though everyone knew he was the superior fighter. Marcus was brutal and dirty, but Caden was a warrior king who had earned his crown through conquest and blood. Still, Arya couldn't shake the fear that somehow she would lose him, that the universe was cruel enough to give her hope only to rip it away. On the night before the combat, Caden came to her rooms and asked permission to enter. She granted it, and for the first time, she let him sit beside her on the couch instead of across the room. His presence was warm and solid, and when he carefully, slowly reached for her hand, she let him take it. Their fingers intertwined, and the mate bond hummed with contentment at the contact. "I'm afraid," she admitted quietly. "Afraid you'll be hurt because of me." He squeezed her hand gently, his thumb tracing small circles on her skin. "I've fought 100 battles," he said softly. "Tomorrow will be no different except that I fight for something that matters more than any kingdom or crown. I fight for you, for your safety, for your right to live without fear. That makes me stronger than I've ever been." She turned to look at him, really look at him, and saw not the fearsome alpha king but a man who had chosen her healing over his own convenience, who had been patient when he could have been demanding, who had made himself vulnerable when he could have hidden behind power. "I'm starting to believe you," she whispered. "Starting to believe that you're different." His eyes closed as if her words had struck him somewhere vital, and when he opened them again, they were bright with emotion. "That's all I ask," he said hoarsely. "Just keep believing, one day at a time, until maybe someday you can love me the way I already love you." The combat took place in the old ceremonial arena, a circular stone structure that had hosted such challenges for 1,000 years. The entire court assembled to witness, along with representatives from every major pack in the realm. Caden stood in the center of the arena, in nothing but loose fighting pants, his muscled torso marked with scars from a lifetime of warfare. Marcus faced him from the opposite side, smaller but vicious, a fighter who won through dirty tactics and ruthless opportunism. When the horn sounded to begin, both men shifted into their wolves, and the battle was joined. Caden's wolf was massive, a silver and black beast with eyes like molten gold and fangs that could crush bone. Marcus's wolf was brown and scarred, quick and mean. They clashed in a fury of teeth and claws, circling and striking, testing each other's defenses. Marcus fought like he had lived, with dirty tricks and cruel efficiency, going for tendons and soft tissue, trying to cripple rather than confront directly. But Caden was a trained warrior, a king who had built his reputation on the battlefield, and he countered every strike with brutal precision. The fight was savage and bloody, both wolves tearing into each other with primal fury, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Caden was fighting for love, and that made him unstoppable. The end came when Marcus made a desperate lunge for Caden's throat, overextending in his eagerness for a killing blow. Caden sidestepped with liquid grace and caught Marcus by the neck, his jaws clamping down with crushing force. It would have been easy to kill him, to end it with one final bite, but Caden remembered his promise to Arya. He wanted her free, not blooded by more death. He forced Marcus into submission instead, holding him down, until the other wolf went limp in defeat, whimpering his surrender for all to witness. Only then did Caden release him, shifting back to human form and standing over Marcus's broken wolf with absolute authority. "You will leave this kingdom tonight," Caden commanded, his voice carrying across the silent arena. "You will never return, never speak her name, never even think of her again. If you violate this banishment, I will not be so merciful a second time." Marcus shifted back, bloodied and defeated, and crawled away without a word, his shame complete. The crowd erupted in cheers for their king, but Caden's eyes were only for Arya, who stood in the royal box with tears streaming down her face. He climbed up to her, ignoring the medics who wanted to tend his wounds, and stopped just before reaching her, waiting for permission. She closed the distance herself, throwing her arms around him and burying her face in his chest, not caring that he was bloody and battered. "You're safe now," he murmured into her hair, his arms coming around her carefully, always carefully. "He can never hurt you again. I promise you're safe." The months that followed were a revelation for both of them. With Marcus gone and the immediate threat eliminated, Arya began to truly heal, attending therapy sessions with a pack counselor who specialized in trauma recovery. Caden accompanied her when she asked, learning about the depths of what she had endured and how he could better support her healing. He discovered that love wasn't about grand gestures, but about consistent small acts of care, about learning her triggers and respecting her boundaries, about celebrating every tiny step forward without pushing for more. He also threw himself into reforming the kingdom's laws regarding Omega rights, discovering that Arya's abuse had been enabled by systemic oppression that treated Omegas as lesser beings. Working with progressive council members and Omega advocates, he began dismantling centuries of discriminatory legislation, establishing protections for vulnerable pack members, and creating consequences for domestic violence that had previously been ignored. It was slow, frustrating work that earned him enemies among the traditionalists. But every time he looked at Arya and saw her growing stronger, he knew it was worth every political battle. What Caden didn't know was that Chief Counselor Aldrich was growing increasingly desperate. The reforms threatened his power base and exposed corruption that he had carefully hidden for decades. He had been profiting from the Omega trafficking trade, taking bribes from alphas who wanted access to vulnerable Omegas without legal consequences. Arya's rise to power threatened to shine a light on everything he had built, and desperate men did desperate things. He began gathering allies among the traditionalist faction, those who resented the changes Caden was forcing on the kingdom, and together they plotted to remove the Omega Queen before her coronation could make her position unassailable. The assassination attempt came during a garden party celebrating the completion of the new Omega Sanctuary, a safe house where abused Omegas could find protection and resources. Arya was giving a speech about the importance of the sanctuary when a hired assassin struck from the crowd, a poisoned blade aimed at her heart. But Sarah, her loyal guard, had been watching carefully and intercepted the strike, taking the blade in her shoulder. Instead, the assassin was captured before he could flee, and under interrogation, he revealed everything: Aldrich's involvement, the trafficking network, the conspiracy to eliminate Arya and frame it as an attack by Omega rights extremists. The betrayal cut deep, not just for Caden, but for the entire kingdom. Aldrich had been a trusted advisor for 30 years, and his corruption had infected the highest levels of government. Caden's response was swift and merciless. He had Aldrich and his co-conspirators arrested and tried before the full council, with evidence of their crimes presented in exhaustive detail. The trial lasted 3 days, and ended with Aldrich being stripped of his title and exiled, his assets seized to fund reparations for the Omegas he had trafficked. It was a purge that shook the kingdom's power structure to its core, but it also sent a clear message. The old ways were dead, and anyone who tried to resurrect them would face the king's wrath. Through it all, Arya stood beside Caden, no longer the cowering Omega, who flinched from raised hands, but a woman growing into her strength and her role. She spoke at Aldrich's trial, her testimony powerful and clear, describing the system of oppression that had enabled her abuse and countless others. She didn't speak with hatred, but with determined compassion, making it clear that the goal wasn't revenge, but justice. Not punishment, but reform. The kingdom watched their future queen and saw someone who had survived the worst they had to offer, and emerged demanding better for everyone. 6 months after the assassination attempt, with the kingdom stabilized and reforms well underway, Caden asked Arya to marry him properly. He didn't command or assume, even though the mate bond made them partners in every way that mattered. He knelt before her in the same garden where someone had tried to kill her, in the place she had reclaimed as a symbol of hope, and offered her a choice. "I love you," he said simply. "I love your strength and your compassion, your courage and your kindness. I love who you were, who you are, and who you're becoming. Will you choose me, Arya? Not because fate decreed it, but because your heart wants it. Will you be my wife, my queen, my partner in all things?" Arya looked at this man who had proven his love through action rather than words, who had changed an entire kingdom's laws because her suffering had shown him the depth of injustice, who had been patient through every setback and celebrated every small victory in her healing. She thought about the girl she had been, broken and terrified, convinced she deserved nothing but pain, and she thought about the woman she was becoming, strong enough to stand before crowds and demand change, healed enough to accept love without waiting for the cruelty that used to follow. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain. "Yes, I choose you. I choose us. I choose the life we're building together." Before we continue with their beautiful wedding, and the life they built together. If you haven't already, please take a moment to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that healing is possible and that real love waits with patience. The royal wedding was a celebration unlike any the kingdom had seen, not because of its grandeur but because of what it represented. Omegas who had spent their lives being told they were worthless watched one of their own crowned queen. Proof that their suffering had been a lie perpetuated by those in power. The ceremony included traditional elements, but also new rituals that Arya had helped design, acknowledgments of the Omega goddess, and celebrations of gentle strength alongside dominant power. When Caden placed the crown on her head, his hands were steady, but his eyes were wet with tears, overcome by the journey that had brought them to this moment. Their first year of marriage was not without challenges, because trauma didn't disappear just because circumstances improved. There were still hard days when Arya's anxiety spiked without warning, still moments when old fears surfaced unexpectedly, but they had built something stronger than the mate bond, a partnership based on communication and trust, on working through difficulties together rather than pretending they didn't exist. Caden learned that supporting her healing meant accepting that it wasn't linear, that there would be setbacks and struggles, and that his job was to be steady and present through all of it. Arya threw herself into her work as queen with a passion that surprised even her. She established a network of Omega sanctuaries across the kingdom, created educational programs to help Omegas learn skills and gain independence, and worked tirelessly to change the cultural attitudes that had enabled abuse. She spoke publicly about her own experiences, using her story as a tool to help others, refusing to be ashamed of scars that testified to her survival. She became known as the Healing Queen, beloved by those who had been marginalized and respected, even by those who had initially opposed her rise to power. Together, Caden and Arya reshaped the kingdom into something better than it had been. They ruled as true partners, his strength complementing her compassion, her insight tempering his occasionally autocratic instincts. They fought, because all couples fought. But they fought fair, and always came back together. The mate bond, a foundation they built upon, rather than a cage that trapped them. They laughed together, planned together, dreamed together about the legacy they would leave for future generations. 3 years into their marriage, Arya discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with complex emotions, joy mixed with fear, because pregnancy would make her vulnerable in ways she had worked so hard to overcome. Caden held her through the panic attacks that came with the announcement, reminded her that she was not the helpless Omega she had once been, that she had an entire kingdom ready to support and protect her. The pregnancy was difficult, her body still carrying the physical consequences of past abuse, but she was surrounded by the best healers and the most devoted mate any Omega could ask for. Their daughter was born on a spring morning, a perfect blend of both parents with Caden's storm-gray eyes and Arya's gentle spirit. They named her Luna, after the moon goddess who had brought them together. And looking at her tiny face, Arya felt the last pieces of her broken heart finally heal completely. This child would never know the fear Arya had lived with, would grow up in a kingdom that valued Omegas as equals, would have a father who demonstrated every day that strength and gentleness could coexist. She would inherit a better world because her parents had been brave enough to fight for change. Epilogue. 10 years after that moment in the study, when a raised hand and a flinch had changed everything, Alpha. King Caden stood in the palace gardens watching his daughter play with the children of former servants and council members alike, a kingdom truly beginning to live its reformed values. Arya sat beside him, her hand in his, no longer the terrified Omega who had expected violence, but a queen who commanded respect through wisdom and compassion. They had come so far together, through trauma and healing, through political upheaval and systemic change, through all the messy, complicated reality of building a life together. Sometimes Caden still marveled at how close he had come to missing this, to never knowing the mate who had transformed not just his heart, but his entire understanding of what it meant to be a good leader and a good man. A single moment of unthinking gesture had revealed his mate's pain, and his response to that revelation had set them both on a path to healing. He had learned that real strength wasn't about dominance or control, but about using power to lift others up, about being vulnerable enough to admit when systems were broken and brave enough to fix them. Arya caught him staring and smiled, that radiant expression that still took his breath away every time. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, though the mate bond probably gave her some sense of his emotional state. He squeezed her hand gently, his touch still always careful, always respectful of the boundaries she had needed to heal. "I'm thinking about how lucky I am," he said honestly. "How that terrible moment led to everything good in my life. How you taught me what it really means to be a king worth following." She leaned her head on his shoulder, comfortable in a way she never could have imagined being with an alpha all those years ago. "We taught each other," she corrected gently. "You showed me that not all strength is violent, that I could be safe in someone's protection without giving up my power. We built this together." And their daughter's laughter rang out across the garden, the sound of hope made manifest. Proof that healing was possible, and that love, real love, the kind that chose patience over force and understanding over dominance, could transform not just two broken people, but an entire kingdom. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey of healing, redemption, and transformative love. If this story touched your heart, please share it with others who might need to hear that recovery is possible and that true strength lies in gentleness. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more stories that explore the power of love to heal and transform. Your comments and support mean the world. Until next time, may you find the courage to heal and the wisdom to love with patience.